Jonathan Kaufman, person who has been talking a lot about staging in his writing lately, wrote a piece called The Pros and Cons of Staging in a Restaurant. And I really think that this one was exactly right up my alley. I talk about this a lot. And yeah, look at this flow, folks. I'm doing this flow thing great. Drag and drop articles. It's the new way to be. And I'm not going to dig too far into it, even though it seems like I'm probably mentioned quite a few quotes from this article. But if you're in the chapter of your career where this is kind of super top of mind, you're either putting together a list of restaurants that you want to start doing reach outs to, or if you have just gotten off of like, okay, well, it's going into the holiday season and my restaurant is closed for a little bit of time, I'm going to go stage. This could really offer a lot of insight into the experience and kind of what to expect, especially if you are new to this whole staging thing. Quote, who do they talk to? They talk to this person, Martinez is the last name, Claudia Martinez, who is the pastry chef at Tiny Lou's in Atlanta. She says, quote, if somebody asked me whether they should stage or go to culinary school, do a stage, which is a great piece of advice. Quote, chefs make a distinction between one-day tryouts when applying for a job and long-term stages. The former are essential, most argue, and not just so employers can see if a prospective cook can make it in their kitchen. As eater young gun Ashley Shanti, chef of Bene on Eagle in Asheville, North Carolina, says, quote, in the industry now, people are starting to wake up and see that self-care is important, as well as creating safe spaces that allow people to have a voice. Those are all important to me, and you can't really gauge where a restaurant is in regards to it unless you spend time there, end quote. And I think that's an interesting point that not a lot of people acknowledge. I think that often can lead young chefs to feel a lot of pressure when they go and stage at a restaurant and they are either so into the notch in their resume of being able to say that they worked there, or they really think that the techniques and experience they'll gain there are super, super important, and you kind of push to the wayside all these other things like how is the culture? Is there a roadmap to you being able to advance and grow at that place? Do you like how the kitchen is laid out? Do you think there are all these other factors that go into experiencing a restaurant when you're there, and sometimes you put so much effort into that first initial point of communication, and you're like, I just want an email back. And sometimes I feel like you can over-index and almost kind of commit to too much, but even though it doesn't feel right, because you think you've put so much effort into securing this opportunity, when in reality, they're interviewing you and you are also interviewing them. You're seeing if it's a good fit for you. And I think that was an issue that I made very early on in my career, where I would say yes to things because it would be stupid for me to say no, if that makes sense. Like, you get an opportunity to work at a place that has Michelin stars and recognition, or the chef has some sort of pedigree behind him or her, and you don't realize that your happiness also ultimately matters. And I think that people set themselves up where they aren't happy, and then their performance starts to suffer, and you kind of wonder, and then you ultimately have a bad experience there. You know what I mean? So it's like you're saying yes in the short term to ultimately hurt yourself in the long term when you make these kind of decisions. It talks about the $149,000 lawsuit at the local, for me, Willow's Inn, and talking about 19 former stages being owed back wages. Obviously, every place is different. You can't say that all stages are unpaid or all internships are good or bad. They're all so different. Quote, that said, in other professions, paying thousands of dollars for continuing education is common. Cooks gain theirs by working for free. 2 years after Martinez's return from Sweden, she's still paying off the plane ticket, rent, and expenses she incurred. Compared to the $80,000 she spent on culinary school, she thinks the cost was worth it. Even though I put myself in a financial bind, I wouldn't go back and change anything. You can always pay people back, end quote. I think that's really important to think about comparing that financial burden when you see the tuition breakdown of some of these culinary schools versus what would it cost for me to subsidize my living expenses and maybe some travel cost to go to this place where they will let me learn and experience what they do, but they won't pay me for my time. But then if I can, stomach the cost of what it's going to be like to spend this time here, compare and contrast. Like, where are you at in your own career? And based on the structure of that learning environment, how much are you going to come away with versus, yes, this thing seems very structured and it seems like I'm going to get this piece of paper that says that I completed something at the end of it, but where is your knowledge base going to be and how prepared do you feel to go out into the real world after this experience that is culinary school, right? Quote, Levi Rains, a 2019 Eater Young Gun and the chef at Bywater American Bistro in New Orleans, cautions that young cooks especially need to look beyond the romance of a stage to consider what they'd get out of the experience. They don't understand stages involve a lot of picking herbs and menial tasks that don't benefit your skill level as a cook. They can put that on their resume and go around town saying, I worked at Noma, but they're still a terrible cook that has the same skill level they had when they went in, end quote. And I think a lot of people not suffer from that, but fall into those trappings of like, well, yeah, I paid like $8,000 to go to Copenhagen and subsidize my rent in a little shitty apartment. I should be able to say that I worked at Noma. And the fact of the matter is, I think that there's a pretty common trend in the industry of people saying being able to say that you worked there means that you were paid to work there. And I think that that's a very important distinction that I'm not alone in saying that. I endorse that. I think that if you say that you stage somewhere, that often can bring to light the actual relationship and the transaction, quote unquote, that happened, where it's like you were giving your time for free. The restaurant didn't have anything to lose. And so they put some trust in you to let you spend time in their kitchen and prep for them, yes, but also learn from them and kind of see behind the curtain in exactly what happens there. And I'm, the type of person who says that I staged at Noma, and then the person that isn't in the industry will take that as, oh, Justin worked at Noma, right? No, I spent time there for free. I went on a recommendation of someone from Per Se, and that was kind of like my time there. But people who don't know the difference between working for free and the intense process that goes into what it takes for Noma to write you a pay. I mean, I remember working for free at Per Se, and the only goal of mine was to get a check given to me from Thomas Keller Restaurant Group. I just wanted to know that Thomas Keller was going to pay. So I always say I did my externship at Per Se, but I worked at French Laundry, right? Because I have pay stubs from this restaurant, right? If you don't have a pay stub, I caution people to say that they worked there, because oftentimes that can kind of get misconstrued. And I know that, when you're documenting your experience, oftentimes you think through what you learned at all these places. And I mean, I've had places where I've worked where I've gotten less quote unquote experience and insight than the places that I've staged at, if that makes sense. So I think it all depends on where you are at in your career. I think it all depends on the open-mindedness that you have. I know that, there are people who spent just as long at certain places as I did, and I came out way more knowledgeable and I just gained more skills when I was there than these people who just came in and clocked in and did their prep list and kind of went home. Does that make sense? Like, I stayed after. I did extra projects. I tried to pay extra attention. I tried to weasel my way into opportunities that I wasn't quote unquote ready for, because I wanted to just squeeze the orange for as much juice as I could. Bringing it back to talking about that benefiting your skill level as a cook, as this person says, I think that is kind of the kicker, where there's this great quote from Daniel Boulud where he says, you'll learn more, and I'm going to totally butcher it, but this is how my brain remembers it. You will learn more cleaning lobster at a Michelin-starred restaurant than you will working the grill station at a country club. In that just your observation of people executing at this incredibly high level can often do more for yourself, not just in your confidence, but kind of like how you perceive what working in a restaurant at a really high level does, rather than just, oh, well, I know how to cook 20 steaks a night, medium rare. Does that make sense? Quote, Carlo LaMagna, owner of Magna in Portland, agrees. Even with 15 years under his belt, he staged at the Modernist Cuisine Kitchen in Seattle a few years back for kicks. I think the more experienced you are, the more you get out of it. When you're a green cook, you don't see the nuanced things, how they put a piece of meat on a trivet in a particular order, how they set up their station, the tools that they use. Or you do see the tools, but don't understand the exactness of everything. On his path from culinary school to restaurants, from Chicago to Portland, and from his European-based cuisines and Filipino-American food, Labagna has interned all over. Some of his best experiences were at smaller venues where the cooks took an interest in him. The most famous, which he won't name on the record, the vibe was so abusive, he quit. And I think that is good in both scenarios. I think when you're young, staging is more important. When you're more experienced, I think eating is more important. Does that make sense? So if you're just super green and you're just starting and you don't know how to do things, I think the common trappings that people often fall into, and people talk shit on the internet and memes all about this, is you'll spend, 3-4 years at a restaurant when you're starting off your career, and then you only know that restaurant's way to do things. And I think it makes you sometimes very close-minded, and that will often lead to, when you're at your next job, that meme that I was talking about, when people say, oh, well, at my last restaurant, at the last place I worked, we blank, insert blank. We used to wash the spinach like this. This is how we put our chickens in the walk-in. This is how we stored our radishes, blah, blah, blah. And I think that can often close you in, and you put blinders on, and you don't. I think the benefit I had when I started off my career is I was constantly in new kitchens, not just at CIA where we changed classes every 3 weeks, but also when I staged a ton, you start to see how different chef de partie set up their stations, and how, so-and-so expedited in this way, but then when you're in this kitchen, they don't call back after so-and-so communicates this. And you become more open-minded, and you're like, okay, well, maybe there is more than one way to do this. And then you start to see that, different kitchens require different constraints. And I think that all benefits when you're starting off early. I don't think that it's necessarily like, oh, well, I have to go here when I'm prepared because then I'll actually be able to understand. But I think you're such a dry sponge when you start, right? And just any little droplet of water is going to get soaked into you. Whereas when you're older, sometimes those nuances can be picked up just by going and supporting that restaurant via having a meal there. And you'll start to see like, oh, well, they did the pigeon with XYZ tuile, and this was the vegetable garnish on it. And like, I know exactly how they did that vegetable. And it was really interesting because I ate at this restaurant in Atlanta called Staple House, and they served a dessert component, which was honeycomb, which for those of you that don't know is like you add an alkaline to honeycomb and it reacts with the acid, and you bring the honeycomb to this texture where when it does the Coke and Mentos thing, it foams up, right? And then you pour it out when the sugar consistency is at a point when it's going to harden, and you basically have these aerated bubbles inside honey. And it's normally a dessert garnish because it's obviously sweet, it's honey. But I saw this pastry component served on a savory dish. I was on a pork dish, and it was like really small, and it just added this great like kind of pop of crunchy sweet, but like everybody knows barbecue sauce with pork, sweet savory, right? And it was just like, oh, that was really cool. Whereas if I was, but the thing is, I knew how to do that technique, right? I knew how to make honeycomb. And so then I was able to kind of draw that distinct, I understood from a conceptual point of view why that dish made sense. Whereas if I would have had that meal when I was super early on, I would have been like, what were those sweet crunchy bits in the pork, right? And then you contrast that where if I were to go and stage at a restaurant now, I more or less know kind of like what the behind the scenes are. So from a staging perspective, I'm not going to get that much value from standing there and picking herbs or polishing mushrooms, right? And so I think that would be the only advice that I would contrast that with is, yes, the benefit is there to going out to eat when you're early on and when you're more experienced, and the same for staging. There's benefit to staging when you're further on in your career and when you're young, but I don't know. I don't necessarily agree that staging is best when you're more experienced, if that makes sense. I think I've got one more quote in here. It's from Sayat Ozyilmaz and Laura Ozyilmaz, husband and co-chef at Noosh. They say that during their time at the Culinary Institute of America, he staged at Blue Hill at Stone Barns for close to a year. He wouldn't change a single day, he says, yet he won't gloss over its intensity. Quote, when they criticize the way you peel onions, fold your towel, tie your shoes, the way you wipe the counter, all of a sudden you find yourself in a vulnerable position of questioning everything you do. Fine dining is built on ripping off your confidence so you can't make your own decisions. Then the struggle of getting your footing builds it back up, end quote. And then his wife, of course, says she'd never recommend anyone work for free for a year, especially in an environment that could exacerbate anxiety, mental illness, and addiction. But a month or two, that would be valuable to the right person. I think that's kind of funny that dichotomy exists in a couple. But again, I think that is the importance when it's really hard. If you have all this experience of, the kind of rough and tumble, high volume environment of, say, you were a caterer for a really long time and you're kind of stuck in your ways, you've kind of calcified, solidified as far as your habits go and your working motions and how you decide to set up yourself or how you move about a kitchen. And then you go to try to stage somewhere that's possibly out of your league, right? They're operating with a certain level of precision that didn't exist in the kitchens that you have worked in the past. It can be really hard, especially if you tie up your identity in like, oh, I'm a great chef. And it's like, well, you're great at executing in this kind of an environment, but then you go to another one and it's totally different. And I think that when you're a little bit more young and malleable, that's why I push people, especially early on. And that's why I put out the content that I put out there, because you're better off when you're malleable to kind of get that experience, as opposed to being someone who is a little bit more stuck in their ways. You've created those ruts already, and it's a little bit harder to change. If you want to see a little bit of what happens behind the scenes at a place that is operating at a